Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, we're going to react to how a second American Civil War could spark World War III. Now, I'm failing to see the connection here. Because a domestic conflict, why would that have, implications on the world stage? Why would any other country want or need to get involved? Unless it was something to do with, like a massive sort of breach in human rights or something like that. But even then, I just can't imagine why any external nation would want to get involved.
A second American Civil War is a matter of concern for many Americans. Not too long ago, I put together a video on the very subject, as a matter of fact. In the case of an insurgency, whether it be a right-wing or left-wing insurgency, it would be safe to assume that the federal government and its army, regardless of which faction controls it, would emerge victorious. But then a more widespread, albeit less likely scenario came to mind: mass state secession. Now, in the event of a right-wing state secession, the outcome would likely be somewhat similar to what I described in my video on why insurgency, especially a right-wing insurgency, would be doomed to fail. Notably, in the event of any secession, the seceding party will likely only be able to break away a fragment of its population, those states which have the highest concentration of their support base. The Democrats have an advantage here in that their most devout states have extremely high levels of development, port access, large concentrated populations, and more. In the case of a right-wing state,
particularly California alone has 38 million people?
Secession, the most likely culprits would be the plain states who are geographically very difficult to defend, underdeveloped, and landlocked with the exception of Texas. A right-wing state secession scenario would be almost as futile as an insurgency scenario. However, in the case of a left-wing state secession, that complicates things. First and foremost, it must be restated how unlikely it is for this scenario to occur. It would require massive levels of backdoor scheming by politicians, deeper levels of polarization between the political parties than are publicly visible and inferable, a greater support for the America First faction of the Republican Party than is currently realistic. It would demand the complacency and cooperation of several external powers and more. Really a very specific sequence of events to go a certain way, but it is possible. And given just how massive of a conflict a second American Civil War could become under these circumstances, I thought it was worth sharing as wholly hypothetical food for thought. A peek into an unlikely but fascinating alternate future, or maybe an alternate history depending on when you watch this. Now, some of us might mistakenly assume a third world war would find its combat concentrated in Europe if in fact it is a conventional war much like the first two. However, the First and Second Great Wars only took place in Europe because the states within that part of the world had the ability to make war between themselves a massive global conflict. Today, yes, the powers of Europe are influential, especially economically, but military might has definitely shifted from Europe to the United States and Asia.
100%.
Just as a European power...
Although a lot of European countries have started to increase military spending, the UK, we have upped our military spending to 2.5% of GDP. I think it's currently 1.9%. I think France and Germany have both wanted to increase their spending too. So Europe is definitely now starting to kind of wake up from its, I would say, over-reliance on the US military. Obviously, the US military is a very, very close ally of ours, but I don't think we should be able to defend ourselves as well.
Struggle pulled in all the countries with which they were interconnected, so too could an American power struggle from within the United States itself pull into itself the global world order the US has established, as well as all those who seek to challenge it. This is how a second American Civil War could trigger World War III. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. If you enjoy this type of hypothetical and alternate history content, I would also recommend checking out our second channel after this video. Picture: Election 2024. Despite massive efforts on the part of the Democratic Party and its allies to force Trump out of the election, strengthen Biden's support base, and win a re-election, the Republicans have won across the board. Trump takes the presidency, and both houses of Congress are dominated by the Republican Party, specifically members of Trump's America First faction of the party, ensuring his policies won't be challenged or held up by neoconservative establishment elements. There is outrage in deeply democratic states, and opponents of the Republican Party begin challenging the outcome of the election, asserting that there was interference and manipulation through domestic and/or foreign actions. Countries like...
Which is basically what happened last time, wasn't it? Because a lot of people questioned the authenticity of the election result. Didn't they say that there was tampering with the ticket machines or the voting machines or something like
China, Russia, and Iran are pointed to as culprits, and the most deeply democratic states refuse to recognize the election as legitimate, claiming Joe Biden the winner of the election nonetheless. Dispute follows dispute, and eventually the states of California, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine secede from the Union, claiming themselves to be the legitimate government of the United States.
Wow.
The Republican states would hesitate to respond both on account of a desire to not escalate the situation to war, but also from a willingness to just be rid of these states which shifted elections so far in the opposition's favor. However, the secession would almost immediately begin spelling problems for the Republican states. The Democratic states had essentially cut the Republicans off from the Pacific Ocean and would quickly begin fortifying ties with countries sympathetic to the Democratic cause. Countries which thrive or even depend upon the US-led economic and political order built up by the neoliberals and neoconservatives have long held concerns of just how this order would be impacted by a more withdrawn Trump administration. And now, with Trump signaling a possible exit of the US from the United Nations, the restructuring or utter abolition of NATO, and the enactment
that would cause a lot of Western Europe to side with the Democratic states for sure. For sure. Like, I don't know why Trump, said that he wants to, I think, potentially withdraw the US from NATO, because militarily, the US does carry a lot of weight there, but on the intelligence side, the UK and Germany in particular provide tons of intel. We all bring certain things to the table.
Of various protectionist tariffs, the Democratic states representing and standing by the old world order would see much of Western Europe and various parts of Asia stand behind them. This arrangement puts the Republican states in a precarious spot politically, losing its recognition as the legitimate United States to several major powers. Further, post-election protests led by anti-Trump activists across major cities in red states would escalate to full-on violent riots, forcing Trump to activate the Insurrection Act as he promised he would do in such a circumstance, and see federal troops take action in these cities. Eventually, tensions between the Republican and Democratic states reach a boiling point. Perhaps there is a dispute over territory or resources, or perhaps the Democratic states retaliate against the Republican states for the use of the Insurrection Act, and thus the secession devolves into a civil war. With the secession of states giving both America's legitimacy, the military is split, though largely
I think it's a bit of a leap to assume that would then go straight into a civil war. I think there would be, the time between those two things would be considerable. There'd be so much attempts at negotiation, because an all-out war is the last resort.
Standing with the Republican states. However, what the Democratic states lack in raw domestic manpower, they make up for in alliances, receiving aid and direct military and logistical support from several major countries including Canada and Mexico. The Canadians looking to perpetuate the old world order, and the Mexicans fearing a more aggressive approach toward them from the Republican states given Republican calls for military intervention within Mexico. Taking advantage of international preoccupation with the Americas, Russia, China, Iran, and others seized on the opportunity to launch their own offensives against desired targets that would otherwise be under the protection of the American and greater Western umbrella. China and North Korea launch operations against Taiwan and South Korea. The Taiwanese putting up significant resistance but being unable to hold off the overwhelming numbers being thrown at them by China both in men and weaponry. Taiwanese missile defenses are exhausted on outdated Chinese missiles launched as decoys and are quickly followed by advanced strikes against Taiwan's defenses. North Korea, supplemented by Chinese forces, would be up against a much larger population, one roughly twice its own size, albeit one nowhere near as militarized as its own. With numbers and superior technology on their side, the South Koreans, though initially losing land in the north, do effectively hold off their opponent and begin gradually retaking ground. However, the Chinese and North Koreans attempt to use internal divisions within the south to their advantage. The Japanese, recognizing their own position would be compromised if Taiwan or South Korea fell, would be forced to redirect its support away from the Democratic states and concentrate on aiding its neighbors in East Asia, possibly swaying over the support of the Philippines, who would not want to find themselves in a more vulnerable position if
Wow, everybody's involved here. Jeez, how did the Philippines get involved in this?
China seized Taiwan. Russia in turn may begin its own naval operations against Japan to aid China and North Korea. India and Australia may also be pulled into the conflict based on prior quadrilateral security discussions, and a recognizing of the disproportionate influence China would have on the region if they expanded unchallenged. Though with Australia being more geographically removed than Japan or India, they would most likely assume a position of support rather than direct engagement.
Yeah, Australia would definitely, stay out of this, I think. Considering their location, being so far away and isolated, it would be in their interest to not get involved.
Russia, recognizing that NATO is effectively neutralized by the American Civil War and that nuclear retaliation by France or Britain would not be a viable option against their much larger arsenal, advances further across Ukraine if the war between them has not been resolved by that point. Georgia would be moved upon by Russia and possibly triggering some military engagement with Turkey, and further the Russians may begin a campaign against the Baltic states no longer secured by the US and NATO. In the absence of foreign support, Ukraine is quickly whittled down until Poland steps in to occupy and secure the northwest of the country from further Russian expansion. The Poles would then move on to Kaliningrad and launch their own operation to defend the Baltics. Facing pressure,
a lot of people are saying that if Russia somehow wins this conflict with Ukraine, that they're going to go into Poland. I just don't see that happening personally. Like, you know, I know some people are going to say, oh, you know, Putin's not going to stop at Ukraine, but does Putin really think that he could, you know, take Poland? Like, he's probably not even going to take Ukraine. Putin is probably just waiting for Zelensky to come to negotiate, you know, and surrender some land, which I'm not saying Zelensky should do. But I just don't think Putin would ever dare to go into Poland.
From Russia and Belarus all across the east, Poland would begin to see the rest of North, Central, and Western Europe stand behind them, though of course this would cut off European support to the democratic states. Iran would seize the opportunity to intensify its conflict with Israel, possibly doing so with the assistance of Syria, being further entangled in Russia's potential conflict with Turkey. The Saudis, seeing an opportunity to cripple their long-standing rival, would join Israel and Turkey in combating Iran and Syria. At this point, any major Israeli and Saudi aid to the democratic states would also be hampered. Support for the democratic states would be severely undermined by these attacks, forcing the global alliance to turn their attention to these more domestic fronts and combat the coalition of Russia, China, and Iran. Simultaneously, the coalition would be providing whatever aid it could spare to the Republican war effort for no other reason than to prevent a resurgence of the democratic states and to keep the American war burning for as long as possible, leaving the country destabilized in the aftermath and unable to respond.
Honestly, war is just terrible. Like, when you think about it, war is basically very, very, very few people sending thousands and thousands, millions of younger people to their deaths. I think, personally, if you want to take your country to war, you, the leader, have to be on the front line. If you sign that into law, you would see a massive reduction in wars. You would, because, you know, they get to just sit in their ivory tower and just play battleships while young people are the ones that are going to go and die.
Onto the coalition's actions. As the global conflict took shape, foreign investment in the Democratic faction would wane, seeing the Democratic States' Pacific allies tied up in a war against China and the European allies at war with Russia. All that would remain of the Democratic States' major allies would be Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Mexico. In North America, Canada's prairie provinces would be hollowed out and occupied by the Republican states, having swept across the plains after a long and grueling campaign of trench warfare which saw the Democratic forces collapse from attrition. However, the coastal lands and those around the Great Lakes held strong, maintaining formidable defenses supported by a majority of the Navy and Air Force. The assistance of Mexico would allow the West Coast to press its domain as far as the Rockies, despite having to deal with large insurgencies across the north. Mexican forces would cause significant difficulty for the Republicans in Texas, utilizing a combination of conventional and guerrilla warfare to press beyond the US-Mexico border and launch attacks within the Republican states through loyalist cells. Simultaneously, the Republican states would be forced to contend with a mass pro-democratic insurgency across the Black Belt region. Despite the initial advantage the Republican states would have held, facing war on all sides would prove exhausting for the military and severely hamper the war effort, dragging it along far longer than it would have otherwise. After years of global...
At this point, you know, millions of people are dead. For sure. For sure. Millions. Potentially families, bloodlines ended as well. If there was a family with, you know, one child.
War, peace is not brought about immediately through a single treaty, but gradually through multiple independent agreements and understandings. The North Koreans, recognizing their losing struggle, desperately deployed their nuclear arsenal against South Korea and Japan. The Japanese are able to intercept the missiles before they strike the Japanese mainland, but several are able to breach South Korean defenses in time and the country is hit. North Korean forces invade, supported by Chinese reinforcements. Japan is forced to withdraw. Korea is unified under the North. But Japan remains independent and begins remilitarization and nuclearization to defend itself. Taiwan's resistance was intense, but with only Japan and the Philippines to lend it direct support, it soon crumbled under Chinese pressure. Isolated, the Philippines would be forced to bend to Chinese desires, but remain nominally independent. Russia would place its campaign in the Caucasus on the back burner to concentrate on its more strategically valuable and opportune European front. Any further annexation of Ukraine is halted by the Ukrainian-Polish alliance, and having been exhausted by this conflict, the Russians performed poorly in the Baltic field. Fortunately for Russia, however, the highly militarized Kaliningrad would have absorbed the brunt of Western combat, giving Russia the opportunity to secure control over Estonia and Latvia, but at the cost of sacrificing Kaliningrad. Poland, Lithuania, and the remnants of Ukraine would establish a new union for the purpose of challenging Russian expansion, exploring.
Wow. I mean, if you offered this scenario to Putin now, he would just take it with every finger on his hands. This is what he wants, really.
Opportunities with France and Britain to establish a military alliance and potentially acquire nuclear weapons to further deter Russia. In the Middle East, the loose alliance of Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia would defeat Iran and Syria. The Syrians would be forced to adopt a new regime and lose lands to both the Turks and Israelis, whilst Iran would be occupied by alliance forces and undergo a demilitarization process, establishing a new friendlier regime akin to the process which followed for the Axis powers in the aftermath of the Second Great War. Finally, the United States would be caught in a dire stalemate. The Republican states would have successfully driven the Democratic states back in several places, even seizing major portions of Canada. But with the sheer concentration of defenses and population, core coastal areas on the east would not be overwhelmed. All the while, the west stood strong, maintaining the Rockies as a powerful natural defense, bolstered by its alliance with Mexico. With the old world order destroyed, the Democratic states no longer have any reason to keep fighting but to survive and thus sue for peace. The United States are fractured, its lands divided between Mexico, Greater California, New England, Quebec, and the Republic of America.
Wow.
Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed.
Crazy scenario. I mean, you've just got to hope and pray such a scenario never plays out. And to be honest, even the narrator said this is just so incredibly unlikely to happen. There would be so many attempts to negotiate before conflict, like that. I do think that some concessions, probably heavy concessions, such as land surrender, will probably take place before war was started. Or potentially, if there were minor conflicts, there would quickly be, attempts to just find some kind of peace. Nobody wants a World War III. Like, it's just, as I mentioned in the video, it's a few old men deciding the fates of millions of young men. It's just, when you look at war as a concept, it's so barbaric. We should be able to, as a species by now, just be able to negotiate and find common ground, without having to just kill each other. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.